You're listening to Business English Pod, the business English podcast for professionals on the move.
Hello and welcome back to Business English Pod for today's lesson on using visuals and describing charts and trends in a presentation. Before we get started, a quick reminder that a PDF transcript for this lesson, along with hundreds of others, is available on the BEP website. Premium members can also access extra resources for every lesson. To take a free trial, just head over to www.businessenglishpod.com. We've all sat through boring presentations with PowerPoints that are just slide after slide of too much text. If all you're doing is reading off your slides, then why do a presentation at all? And if your audience falls asleep, then you've effectively communicated nothing. If you really want to grab people's attention, you use visuals. That could mean not just pictures, but graphs and charts. There's no better way to represent data than with graphs. But the graph doesn't do all the work for you. You still need to give it life and make it a seamless part of your overall presentation. The first thing you might do is to introduce the point you want to make before you use the visual. And remember that your audience might have some understanding of the topic already, so you should acknowledge that. And you can make it dramatic by using foreshadowing and highlighting important points. And just like in any presentation, it's good to use clear transitions between points and slides. In today's dialogue, we'll hear a presentation from Pat, a director with a cell or mobile phone manufacturer called Ambient. He's presenting to the company's sales team about how they've regained market share after a rough couple of years. We will hear how Pat uses visuals to enhance his presentation. As you listen to the dialogue, try to answer the following questions. 1. At the start of his presentation, what does Pat say they will focus on? 2. When talking about the company called Cirrus, what does Pat draw people's attention to? 3. What does Pat say to transition to showing information about Ambient?
Everybody ready? Okay. I'll lead into our discussion today with a quick look at sales over the last 5 quarters. I'm going to bring up our competitors one by one so we can have a look at how they've been doing in contrast to our own performance. Okay. Well, first there's Calltel. As I'm sure you all know, they've been making a play for the low-end market since they sold off their network division. We can see the boost in sales they reaped in Q4 of 2006 when they brought out their new budget price points. But that's only part of the story, as we'll see a little later. Next, we have everyone's favorite, Cirrus. Okay, no love lost there, but let me just draw your attention to the plateau in sales they're facing at the moment with their disastrous 3G rollout. As you can see, it's really put their revenue under pressure in the last 2 quarters. And that brings us to Ambient. As I said at the beginning, it's been a great couple of quarters, and I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear Central Europe now accounts for over 25% of our European sales. That's a 34% year-on-year increase. Fantastic. But we're actually projecting a fairly flat second half as we focus on the higher value product lines, something we'll look at in more detail later.
Now let's go through the presentation again and look at the language and techniques Pat used when working with visuals.
Everybody ready? Okay. I'll lead into our discussion today with a quick look at sales over the last 5 quarters. I'm going to bring up our competitors one by one so we can have a look at how they've been doing in contrast to our own performance.
Pat certainly doesn't waste any time getting into his presentation. He tells the audience very clearly and directly what he's going to start with or lead into. More specifically, he's going to look at sales over the last 5 quarters. The word quarter refers to a 3-month period of the year. You'll often hear people say Q1 to refer to the first quarter, Q2 for the second, and so on. Pat explains further that he's going to compare Ambient's sales with that of their competitors or the other companies in their market. Introducing your points is an effective way to set people up to receive visual information. Let's practice some more ways of doing this.
First, we'll focus on investments in the real estate area.
Let's start off with a quick look at sales.
I'd like to begin by showing you how costs have changed over time.
The first thing I'd like to show you is the competitive analysis.
Now let's get back to the presentation, as Pat talks about one of their competitors.
Okay. Well, first there's Calltel. As I'm sure you all know, they've been making a play for the low-end market since they sold off their network division.
Generally speaking, people don't like it when you assume they don't know anything. As a presenter, it's a good idea to acknowledge what people already know, as Pat does when he says, "I'm sure you all know." In fact, you can use visuals in a presentation to help people understand how the information they know fits into the bigger picture. In this case, Pat is showing the numbers that demonstrate that Calltel is trying to compete in the low-end market, which is where cheaper products are sold. What are some other ways we can acknowledge the audience's knowledge? Let's run through a few more examples.
As you know, we are facing some difficult choices over the next 6 months.
The past year has obviously seen some tough challenges.
Now, I realize everyone understands what's been happening with sales.
I'm sure you all know why we're talking about this.
Now let's hear Pat describe exactly what people are looking at.
Okay. Well, first there's Calltel. As I'm sure you all know, they've been making a play for the low-end market since they sold off their network division. We can see the boost in sales they reaped in Q4 of 2006 when they brought out their new budget price points. But that's only part of the story, as we'll see a little later.
Pat is talking about the increase or boost in Calltel sales in Q4. You can imagine that he's even pointing at the part of the graph that shows this. Pointing with your finger or with a laser pointer can help you direct people's attention. After drawing attention to the sales increase, Pat does something to make the presentation more dramatic. He gives a reason for the increase in sales, but then says that's only part of the story. He means that there are other reasons besides their move into cheaper phones. Pat tells people there are other reasons, but he's going to cover those later. We call this foreshadowing, which means you make people think about something that is going to be revealed later. It creates a bit of excitement. Let's practice some more examples of foreshadowing as you use visuals in a presentation.
I'm afraid it's not all good news, as we'll see in a bit.
So this looks great, but I'll show you something later that is cause for concern.
Will things stay like this? Well, later on I'll show you what the evidence says.
This isn't the only opportunity, as you'll see later in the presentation.
After he's looked at Calltel's sales, Pat moves on to their next competitor, which people clearly love to hate.
Next, we have everyone's favorite, Cirrus. Okay. No love lost there. But let me just draw your attention to the plateau in sales they're facing at the moment with their disastrous 3G rollout. As you can see, it's really put their revenue under pressure in the last 2 quarters.
Pat wants people to look at a specific part of the graph. In other words, he wants to draw their attention to a particular point. He's showing them a plateau on the graph, which is a flat line that shows no change. Pat explains that this lack of growth is a result of a terrible or disastrous product launch or rollout. So, as he demonstrates, it's not enough just to give people a chart to look at. We need to highlight the points we believe are important, or draw attention to certain ideas. Let's run through some more ways to highlight a point when referring to visuals.
One thing you'll immediately notice is a marked increase in Q4.
I'd also like to point out the strong growth in the luxury sector.
Now have a look at this little spike in the chart here.
Please note how the rate continues to fall.
So now that Pat has explained the experience of their competitors, he's going to talk about ambient. Let's listen.
And that brings us to ambient. As I said at the beginning, it's been a great couple of quarters, and I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear Central Europe now accounts for over 25% of our European sales. That's a 34% year-on-year increase.
We've been talking about how visuals can keep people interested in a presentation if you use them well. And we've also seen how good presenters create a bit of drama and guide people's attention. This is what Pat is doing when he says that brings us to ambient. Announcing transitions like this helps people follow and keeps them engaged. Let's practice some more ways to call attention to your next slide or graphic.
That's all for sales growth. Now let's have a look at margins.
And that brings us to the next point I'd like to make.
So that's all for 2025. Let's now turn to the estimates for next year.
Next, we've got a comparison of the different regions.
Pat's been focusing on what has happened in sales over the past 5 quarters. But at the end of this part of his presentation, he points to the future, as we can hear.
But we're actually projecting a fairly flat second half as we focus on the higher value product lines, something we'll look at in more detail later.
Pat is talking about projections or predictions for the future. In this case, he's saying that sales might appear flat, like the plateau we heard about before. He also mentions once again that they'll look at something more at a later point in the presentation. This is all part of Pat's effective presentation skills, as he is helping his audience follow along and creating anticipation. Now let's practice some of the language we learned in today's lesson. Imagine you're giving a presentation to your sales team about sales by region. I'll ask you to make statements that describe visuals and direct your audience's attention. We'll guide you through each step in the practice and provide an example answer for each response. Ready? Let's give it a go. Start by introducing the topic of sales by region.
Answer. Okay, I want to start off by looking at sales by region.
Now say that you know everyone realizes sales have dropped in the South.
Answer. Now, I know everyone realizes that sales have dropped in the South.
Next, say that you have an explanation for the sales drop, as they'll hear later.
Answer. In fact, I have an explanation for that drop, as you'll hear later.
Now, highlight on the graph that 3 regions have remained steady.
Answer. So, as you can see right here, 3 regions have remained steady.
Finally, call attention to the next slide on costs by region.
Answer. Next, we'll have a look at costs by region.
We've reached the end of this lesson on how to describe visuals in a presentation. We've covered how to introduce a point, acknowledge your audience's knowledge, and use foreshadowing. We've also looked at highlighting a specific point and calling attention to your next slide. For more practice, premium members can access the online resources and PDF transcripts for this and other lessons on the BEP website. Not a member yet? Then head over to www.businessenglishpod.com and sign up for a free trial to preview some of the extra resources available to members. Thanks for listening, and see you again soon.